All right, all right, all right. Hey ho, let's go. Hello, my legendary friends. And as our theme says, strap yourself in. We're so glad you joined us today for a special edition of Legends and Losers. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who served under both President George W. Bush and Barack Obama, described our guest on Legends and Losers today as, quote, perhaps the finest warrior and leader of men in combat I have ever met. In our effort to hack the greatest leaders of our time, today we're stoked to share with you a conversation that we had with General Stanley McChrystal. General McChrystal is a retired four-star general in the U.S. Army. He's the former commander of U.S. and international security forces in Afghanistan, and he's the former commander of the U.S.'s premier military counterintelligence force, the Joint Special Operations Command. General McChrystal is probably best known for developing and implementing a courageous and aggressive, comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. And he's also well known for creating a cohesive counterterrorism organization that revolutionized interagency operating culture in the United States. Throughout his military career, Stan, as he likes to be called, although you'll see in our dialogue, I have a very hard time calling him Stan. Stan commanded a number of elite organizations, including the 75th Ranger Regiment. After September 11th, 2001, through to his retirement in 2010, the general spent more than 6 years deployed in combat in various leadership positions. In June of 2009, the President of the United States of America, Barack Obama, and the Secretary General of NATO appointed the general to be commander of the U.S. forces and NATO forces in Afghanistan. And during his time commanding in charge of that organization, his command included more than 150,000 troops from more than 45 allied countries. And on August 1st, 2010, he retired from the U.S. Army. Today, General McChrystal is a fellow at Yale University, where he teaches leadership, and you'll learn how much he loves to do that. You'll see that he's become a very sought-after speaker, and you'll see why, on leadership, and he talks to various organizations around the country. He's a celebrated author. In 2013, General McChrystal published his memoir, My Share of the Task, which became a New York Times bestseller. And he's the author of a book that pretty much everybody in business should read. It's called Team of Teams, New Rules of Engagement for a Complex World. And that was also a 2015 New York Times bestseller. Another fascinating thing about General McChrystal, he's now an entrepreneur. He's the founder of the McChrystal Group. And they are dedicated to improving the performance of organizations by bringing lessons from the battlefield to the boardroom. He's also a father and a grandfather. And it is our distinct pleasure to welcome you into our dialogue with four-star U.S. General Stanley McChrystal.
I think the thing that would be legendary about me is I'm a grandfather now, and it has changed my life pretty significantly. I grew up in a big family, as did my wife, but we only had one son. And then when I went to Iraq, I was gone for many years, and I left before my son graduated from high school and came back after he graduated from college. And so while we were close, we weren't physically in contact very much. And my son's not a very outspoken guy anyway, so two of us are both introverts. But now I have two granddaughters, and they live next door to us. One is almost 3 and one is 3 months. And so it has changed me in some pretty interesting ways. I don't think that's earth-shaking, but it's really important for me.
And what are those earth-shaking ways that being a granddad has changed you?
I think the first thing is you suddenly realize that it's not about you. You start a career, anything, the Army or whatever, and you're trying to be as good as you can be, and you're trying to either be successful in units or be about attaining certain rank. When you have a grandfather, suddenly you have a sense of family that has beyond a generation. Now I suddenly feel like a patriarch of a family. I feel responsible. I don't know if anybody else looks at me that way, but I feel like I have to craft certain things that are beyond me, and I like that feeling.
And tell us, what is it you like about that feeling?
Well, you're not it's not, if we take a vacation, it's not where I want to go necessarily, but it's where I want to go because it's where they want to go. If we can do something to make it special for our grandkids or our kids, suddenly that's more satisfying than anything I could do for myself. And that's not expected. I sort of thought I'd get this point in my life in semi-retirement, I guess you'd say, and I'd either be taking up golf or I'd be doing those travel in the world and touching all the things I wanted to. But what I find is I want to craft things for my family and for other friends.
Isn't that interesting? And it sounds like being a grandfather has had an impact on you in a way that was maybe different than being a father.
It is. And I think if I critiqued myself as a father, I was 30 when my son was born. I was busy with my career. I loved my son and I was close to him. But there were so many other things competing for my attention. And when I look back, he wasn't the central thing in my life, and he should have been.
Do you think, as you look back, General, on your life, would it have even been possible to have the kind of career of service that you had, and yet, not maybe have the feelings that you have about being a dad when you were a dad as opposed to a granddad?
Well, that's a great question. I talk to young people about. I think you can balance much better than I did. I do think, however, there are times in any career where if you're going to be good at what you do, it's going to take the majority of your energy, the majority of your time. And so when we talk about work-life balance, I don't think we mean it on a daily basis. I think we mean you average it out over time, because there are going to be days in work where I'm sure you work massive hours. And there are other times when you don't have to. And that's when you have to make that decision to do other things and to focus on what's also important.
And do you feel in the past that you didn't do that?
I didn't. And I think that it just seemed so important to be entirely focused on my profession. It's funny, people say you're in the military or any profession, and in the military they say it's about making rank, or in the civilian world they say it's about making money. I don't think that's what it is. I think what it's really about is it becomes a sense of pride. You get into something and you want to be good at it. And then people who work with you have expectations of you. Suddenly you find yourself pulled along by these commitments that you make that aren't nearly as simple as greed or anything like that.
Yeah. So maybe, General, could you take us back in time and what originally motivated you to join the U.S. military?
Yeah, Chris, if you could call me Stan, I'd appreciate that. When I think of the General, I think of my father.
I kind of like calling you General, but I'll call you whatever you would prefer to be called.
Well, I've certainly been called worse than Stan, so that would be good for me. Yeah, I grew up in a military family. My father was a soldier, a career soldier, and his father was a soldier. I had 4 brothers, and they all went into the Army. I had a sister who married a soldier. And when I was growing up, being a soldier was being what my father was. And I admired my father just extraordinarily until the day he died. And so it wasn't a conscious decision that I will go be a soldier. It was a decision that I would be like my father. And of course, that's a soldier.
And what was it about your dad that inspired you to want to be a warrior and join our military and be a soldier?
Yeah, I've told this to people before. If you ever saw that old movie with Robert Duvall, The Great Santini, where you see this very outspoken guy and he's braggadocious, that was the other end of the spectrum for my father. My father was a combat infantryman, Korea and Vietnam. And I'm told that in combat, he was a very, very effective, tough leader, but he was a very soft-spoken guy. And I never saw him do anything wrong in my whole life, even little things. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't treat people poorly. He didn't take things that weren't his. He never parked in a spot that wasn't authorized. And seeing that experience or seeing that example, and then knowing at the same time he was this soldier warrior, to me was a really inspiring picture.
And so you wanted to emulate his behavior?
I did. I don't think I ever achieved that as in terms of personal demeanor, but I certainly wanted to be the kind of professional people relied on.
Now, Tom Brokaw said that, quote, General McChrystal is a legendary warrior with a fine eye for enduring lessons about leadership, courage, and consequence. And he said that in the context of your memoir, My Share of the Task. Can you walk us through your journey and sort of maybe ultimately how Tom Brokaw gets to a place where he says that about you?
Well, I think Tom Brokaw is guilty of being overly generous there, but I think that my journey was really in the Army just at the end of Vietnam. And so we had an American Army that in many ways was designed and culturally like it had been since World War II, but it was very damaged coming out of Vietnam. So when I went to West Point and then when I graduated and entered the Army, it was an Army in search of its identity, in search of regaining its self-confidence as an organization, in search of reestablishing its credibility. And the first few years of my career were pretty disappointing. I went to the much storied 82nd Airborne Division, but it was maybe a glimmer of what it had been in years past. There were just so many social issues. I thought the leadership was struggling. And so the first experience wasn't this exalted band of brothers that I wanted it to be. There were very positive things, parts of it, but it was just deeply flawed. And so the first thing you had to do is say, well, this is not the Army I expected. Is this the Army I want to be in? And over the first few years, I went through, like many other young soldiers, I went through that, do I want to step out and do something else?
So if I could, I hate to interrupt you, but
please.
It's so fascinating. You have this dream. You're a multi-generation warrior. You're beginning your service, like all of us, I assume, Stan. That's going to be hard for me. We were young people. We have this expectation of doing something legendary. You have this dream that it's going to be a particular way, and there's going to be trumpets and ceremonies, and you're going to feel a certain way, and so forth. And you start your career off, and then there's this disappointment. A, what's that like? And B, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, the first thing I did, and I think it was common at that time, was blame it on the organization. Say we are great soldiers just like our forebears, but it's just a lousy Army and we don't have an opportunity. And of course, you remember that from the end of Vietnam, we didn't go to war for quite a long time. So we're walking around units where there are statues and there are ribbons from previous wars and soldiers in front of us. Gyms are named after heroes. So you feel almost like you're a fraud. You're getting a paycheck every month. You're wearing a uniform. You're a soldier, but you've never soldiered in combat. And so you think that, okay, I'm not really it. Plus the organization doesn't live up to the standards that you wanted and expected. So I don't say rebel, you just live in this disappointment. It started to change. I went to Korea in early 1981 for an assignment, and I came back a year later. I served on a demilitarized zone for a year, and that was a pretty good experience. But it was fascinating because when I got back in 1982, the Army seemed like a different place in just a year. There had been a number of changes. The defense budget has started to go up. But I think more importantly, we had gotten some distance from Vietnam. And so some new policies had been put in, change had occurred, and suddenly the organization seemed like a corporation, any corporation on the way up. And for the next really 20 years, it seemed like every year I was in it, the Army was better. And we were part of this. It was very exciting. There were individual disappointments with various things, but you always felt like we were an organization that had found its integrity. We'd found our ability to lead. We had started to promote and push good leaders, and we were becoming proficient at our craft. And that changed, I think, the culture of the organization, but it certainly changed the mindset and morale of each of us in it.
And around what year would that have been, Stan?
It started in 1981, I'd say. And a lot of people say it was President Reagan's election. I don't think that was it. I think that was part of it. I think America, about 1980, with the solving of the Iran hostage crisis, the distance from Vietnam, the economy started to move again in the stock market. All of those things together put the Army in a place where we started to be a much better place.
And did you feel like that's when your career as a warrior really kicked in?
I do. You start as a lieutenant in the Army, and the first 4 years are learning your craft and sort of figuring out what day of the week it is. What happens is you become, after 4 years of lieutenant, you become a captain and you get the opportunity to command a company. And for an infantryman, that's about 150 soldiers. That's the first time.
And at what age are you at that point, Stan?
About 26 to 28.
Yeah.
You've got enough.
You've got over 100 souls in your command at 26 to 28.
Yeah, you've got enough experience to know how to lead. You now have legal authority that you don't have as a more junior officer. You're a commander, and that's a very important distinction. You have legal responsibility for a significant number of soldiers. And this is the point in your career when I think you could find out if you like the business. Second, if you are good at it, if you have an aptitude for it. This is the rank in which I was woken up midnight one night. One of my soldiers had been playing Russian roulette and lost. And so you go to the tragedy of a young soldier who's mixed up, who has taken his own life. Another night, a couple in my company, a young soldier and his wife, had a fire in their trailer. They were living right off post in a very inexpensive trailer. And what they did was they had this fire in their trailer, and they got back in the fire department, don't go in burning trailers because they're dangerous. And so they were standing outside and preventing it from spreading. And the young wife started screaming because they had left their baby, their 2-month-old baby, in the trailer while they went to the store, which was, of course, unthinkable, but they did. The firemen burst in, and of course, the child died soon after that evening. So, and I tell that story tragic because you're suddenly responsible for soldiers and families who have very human things happen to them in their lives, and you're responsible for the warfighting mission, and you're responsible for a host of other things, and it requires a level of commitment, emotional and professional commitment, that is different, and it gives you enough of a taste to this business to realize that the military is not about really battlefield exploits. It's not about being promoted or medals or glory. It's about people, and it's about deeply flawed people like all of us are, and being responsible for them. And I found out during that part of my career that I loved it. I found out that is what really motivated me. And so from then on, sort of whatever had happened in the Army, I was committed.
And what was it that you loved? I mean, you shared two pretty challenging stories right off the top.
Yeah.
It's hard to sort of hear those stories and go, oh, that sounds like a day in Hawaii. But what was it about those early days as a commander that had that switch go on for you that said, this is where I'm supposed to be? Yeah,
you matter. And I say you matter because you matter to the organization. You lead the organization, but they're not a bunch of automatons that you direct like chess pieces. They're human beings that you ask to do things. There's no better feeling than being out in an operation and you have a group of sergeants that are working for you, and you've developed this relationship with them of mutual confidence, and you look at them and say, Sergeant Smith, can you do that? And Sergeant Smith gives you a smile of a thumbs up, and he says, boss, I got it. There's that feeling that you're both doing your jobs, you both respect the other, and the job is important. And that is very addictive, being a part of something. And it's because it's not about money, because it's not about something small. It always feels bigger than that. Even if you're on training, it's really rewarding.
And what's it like the first time you lead troops in a battle situation?
I was very senior the first time. I was already a general officer because the way my career went, and it was very distressing to me. The first combat that happened during my career was Grenada in 1983, and I didn't go. Only a small number of people went. And then my unit went to Panama right after I'd left it, and that was pretty small too, but I didn't go to that. I went to the first Gulf War, but as I tell people, there wasn't a heck of a lot to that. So the first time I really led soldiers in combat, I was a general officer. in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. And I'm sure it's very different than it would have been if I'd been a captain or a lieutenant and had the experience. And I wish I had had it. But it was funny because it was something that I very much enjoyed. And I don't want that to sound wrong, because if you ask soldiers whether they like battle or war, they will, if they're amongst themselves, they will typically say yes, unequivocally. But they're not answering to what people think. They're not talking about the fighting. They're not talking about the death or the injuries. They're talking about this very intense experience with people upon you whom you are very dependent, and doing something that just seems supremely important. And that creates this bond that people have spoken about and written about, but it's hard to completely convey it because it is just so rewarding is the word I get. It just feels so good to be a part of it.
And how much of it do you think is a feeling of shared mission and shared purpose, and therefore the alignment and the sisterhood and the brotherhood that comes with that? And how much of it is the fact that we assume, of course, Colin and I have never been in the situation, but we assume there's a very clear feeling that everybody's life is at stake. So help us who have not served. What are the dynamics at play that create that shared feeling?
Yeah. First off, if you compare it to an experience, maybe putting your program together where it's difficult and everybody's got to do their part and somebody throws a ball up in the air and you have to know someone else is going to catch it. There's that feeling. Think of a startup. I spend some time with startup companies. They've all got their hands on the oars. They're all pulling hard, and they all have the sense that if they don't do it, the boat will sink. It's a feeling like that. It is tied also to this higher purpose, because military people can always step back and say it's a national mission. But I think that's overblown sometimes, because in reality, we've had some pretty conflicted national missions. People could have very different feelings about the war in Vietnam or Afghanistan and Iraq. There can be deep frustrations with national policy. So what I found is within the military units, you're working very hard to accomplish that mission, but you don't talk about that mission a lot. That's not what everybody says. We have got to make Iraq a safe and stable place. You know that's what you're doing, but you break it down into smaller, more understandable, more tangible. I'm going to make this neighborhood safe so that the Iraqis that I see every day can go to work, so they can shop, they can live without getting killed. Suddenly that becomes understandable. And if you're just on the battlefield, you look at your left and right, and you say, if I don't do my part, my comrades will suffer. And so you separate yourself from a national policy idea, and you focus very much on those people things that are they're just closer to the heart.
Yeah. It's interesting. One of the things we don't hear a lot about is the bond that our service women and men had with the folks in Iraq or Afghanistan, and of course, training them and fighting alongside them, and even the non-combatant folks. Could you share with us a little bit about that? Because I've heard other veterans talk about it, and I think it's something we don't hear very much about, what it's like for you to stand shoulder to shoulder with these folks.
Yeah, I'll start with the hard part of it. The hard part was we don't do much language training in the United States. So as a consequence, we go over to Afghanistan and no soldiers speak Dari or Pashto. And you look different, and we're heavily equipped with all this protective eyewear and body armor. So to an Afghan, we look like a man from Mars. And they can't speak to us.
You guys really do look like you're from the original Star Wars, right? I mean...
And think about a vehicle like this drives into your small Afghan village, armored vehicle, and these Star Wars characters get out and they can't speak your language. And they start motioning for you to do things. Suddenly, developing that trust between people is hard. And so we found you had to break it down. In Afghanistan, we had a saying called shoulder to shoulder. And we put American units partnered with Afghan units, and we put them up close, working together for extended period of times. They lived in the same camps. They worked together. They fought together. And the idea was to build mutual respect at every level in the command so that we were trying to professionalize their forces, but also on our side, we're trying to develop empathy that these are people who have a pretty tough road to hoe. It's easy for us to say, why don't the Afghans fight harder, or why are their leaders corrupt? But in reality, once you develop enough understanding of their situation, you realize it's rational behavior for this very difficult position that they're in. And that's when you start to develop the kinds of bonds that are truly effective.
And how do you as a leader, Stan, I try to put myself in your situation where you've got this, and you tell me if the language I'm using is wrong, but you've got this hybrid force, Americans and Afghanis standing together, and a huge difference in culture. I got to believe even the nonverbal parts of communication that we share in our part of the world are different. I've traveled all over the world. I haven't been to Afghanistan, but different cultures communicate different ways, non-verbally as well as verbally. Religious differences, of course, huge skill differences. And so as a leader, how do you stitch together such a bifurcated organization?
Yeah, it's really difficult because Americans have a tendency to get there and be frustrated. Why aren't the Afghans working harder? Why aren't they less corrupt? Why don't they, you name it, why aren't they more like us? Here I am over here to save your country. Why don't you appreciate that? The Afghans look on the other side and they say, why are the Americans so much more better protected with physical armor than they are? Why are the Americans only there for a year or 6 months and they go home, and the Afghans going to be here until they are killed, essentially? And then there are those all nonverbal cues you talk about that are very offensive, sometimes religious, but sometimes just cultural. How you sit, how you talk to someone, whether you touch someone. We were doing operations early in the war in Afghanistan, and we would go into compounds because their homes have walls around them to protect the privacy of the females. And so we would go in, and initially in the war, people said, well, we will separate the females and search them for weapons. Well, if a man searches the female is dishonored. And so we of course, learned enough to stop that. Then we started moving the women and searching their belongings. And of course, the same thing occurred. It's dishonor for the female. And so that kind of cultural insensitivity, it seems like, wait a minute, we're at war. We don't have to worry about that stuff. You absolutely do, because people fight for reasons like that. Yeah. And so how did you teach your American soldiers to be more culturally sensitive at a time where they got to be paying attention to people trying to kill them? Yeah, you have to speak to them. You have to explain to them, because if you tell an American soldier, okay, I want you to be sensitive to the people that live along this road, and they say, wait a minute, there are improvised explosive devices that are buried in this road, and those people may not have buried them, but they saw somebody bury them and they didn't tell us about it. And so there's this tendency to resent them. But in reality, that population will be killed if they tell the Americans. And so if you're in the population's position, you can't win. So you try to explain to our people exactly what the life of the Afghan, in this case, Afghan villagers, like. You've got to also explain to them the only way for us to succeed in the effort is to win their support. We can't win it militarily by killing them. You can't win it by dropping more bombs. And yet there's this reflexive desire to want to use more military force because it's simpler. And unfortunately, that's egged on a little bit by people in the United States who say, let's take the gloves off. It's tough. Let's get this over with. And problems like that aren't military problems that are solved with a clear military solution. They are problems that are really social at their core. Something like the Taliban exists because of frustrations with the government and society. You fix that, the number of Taliban go down automatically. So American soldiers are smart, and when you get them up close and talk to them, they will absolutely get that.
And so how do you, as a military leader on the ground, when you have a military objective, and yet you know that the military objective isn't going to solve the underlying problem, so how do you delineate between a military objective, secure this part of a town, versus the bigger social political dynamic that you're talking about that you know that just the military objective is not going to address?
Yeah, it can be very frustrating, particularly for very junior members as well as senior members, because sometimes you don't control all the other policy levers for those other parts. But you've got to look at the problem holistically, and you've got to say, our mission is to solve this problem. The military component of this problem we can address, but we can address it without the other parts. It's guaranteed to fail. So what we tried to do, and what you explain to younger soldiers, is as much as we have to, we'll expand what we do to try to take on other parts of that mission so we don't waste the effort that we're making. America doesn't do this really well because we're very overweighted in our military capability and underweighted in our ability to do those other things. And America is not a patient society. There's some positives to that, but there's negatives. And so we want to go in and do things quickly. And some things just take time. It takes time to build trust. It takes time to build institutions of government and whatnot. And so what I did with soldiers is I would spend time talking to them about this. I used to ask a question of young leaders. I'd say, if I told you you couldn't go home until we win, what would you do differently from what we're doing now? And it was very interesting because they were on a 12-month tour, and they typically laugh initially, think I was joking, and I'd say no. And then they'd go, well, I'd do a lot differently, because if we're really going to solve this problem, we've got to do X, X, and X. And you got to unlock that. You got to call to that, because if you keep them narrowly focused as soldiers, we just don't address problems effectively.
And how much, when you ask that question, what a powerful question. When you ask that question, they surface things that maybe weren't being as focused on as maybe they could have been. How did that change your thinking and ultimately the leadership on the ground?
Yeah, it would often change my thinking a lot. So, for example, I would go to an area and I'd ask that question, and a young lieutenant or a sergeant would say, we can never succeed until the police chief of this town is removed and someone not corrupt is put in. And we can never succeed until the village elders in this area allow this other, typically villages were multiple tribes represented in the village, until the village elders would allow another tribe to get some kind of equity in the economic balance here. And look at that, that's a hairy problem. And you say, well, wait, we don't have the right to get involved. But the young leader would say, if you don't solve that, we can't get at the rest of these. And then they say, all right, now we have to take it on. And it just, I used to tell people how complex it was, and I always was underestimating it.
And maybe share with us a little bit about our military training, but at least for those of us civilians, I hear you talk about what you're talking about right now. How much training do you get in bringing together two tribes or settling disputes amongst people so that there can be, peace and acceptance and trust, and as opposed to learning to be a sharpshooter or being in great shape or learning how to jump out of an airplane or learning how to do, all the things that learning how to build bridges, all the things that we think about when we think about our military.
Yeah. Our military's training has always been skewed to the warfighting tasks. And the argument was, if you have a very effective military to fight wars, to fight major opponents like Russia, China, or whomever, then you can do all the lesser included tasks automatically because they're not quite as dangerous as the big threat of Russian tanks rolling across Europe. We found out, or at least I came strongly to believe, that that's incorrect, because the skewing to focus on just military capability, particularly in the mindset, limited people, because it became somebody with a hammer is always looking for a nail. And so there was a tendency at every level, from senior general officer on down, to want to take the problem and shape that problem until it fit something that they were well suited and comfortable addressing. And if you step back and say, now, wait a minute, let's identify the problem correctly. Let's really identify the layers of the problem and then say, okay, what's it going to take to fix it? And not use as an excuse, well, we're just military and somebody else ought to handle the other things. Then you do it more effectively. Interestingly, although we train young soldiers and young sergeants in a fairly narrow way, and we expect officers to have this big view, I found young sergeants the most effective at this. I found young sergeants, you put them in a village and you say, solve the problem. They will step back and go, okay, I got it. Let me figure out the problem. And they would. They seem to be less constrained by years of doctrinal training, less constrained by potentially looking good, ambition, or any of those other things. And I'm not saying that's evil on the part of more senior people, but it becomes a habit. And so I found young sergeants and soldiers the most effective.
Do you think there's increased optimism there at that young age? Does that have anything to do with it?
Well, that's a great question. If you spoke to them, they would sound the opposite. They would sound negative, and the senior leaders would sound optimistic. But I think for the senior leaders, it's a learned behavior. As we get older and we're in a lot of leadership and social situations, we learn to be upbeat. We learn to smile even when we don't want to. We learn to say, yeah, things went well even when they went terribly. And we develop almost a false demeanor because we think that's expected of us. At the junior level, they haven't learned that. And so when it's lousy, they say it's lousy. And I actually find it's more honest, and it allows them to really go with the problem. And they don't think just because they say it's lousy that it's hopeless.
And so do you think more of our senior leaders need to sometimes say it's lousy? I mean, do we need to learn from those young troops on the ground to be maybe a little bit more candid?
Yeah, I think we do. And if you step back, and I've talked to people about the paradox of very senior leadership, because take a CEO of a big corporation, or take a political leader, or take a general, and you put them on CNBC or put them on somewhere, and you say, well, how's the company doing? That CEO goes, company's doing great. Stock price is cut in half, but that leaves us more room for improvement. This is a great thing. And so it's not necessarily evil. It's this learned behavior that we think we have to do that because markets will react poorly, soldiers will react poorly. When I was a 4-star in Afghanistan, I was quietly telling the government, our government, that I thought we had at best a 50-50 chance of success. And we had to do a lot of things differently. But if we did those differently, we still had a 50-50 chance of success. If I turned to the 150,000 soldiers in my command and said, ladies and gentlemen, I give us a 50-50 chance of success, let's go forward, that would not be considered great leadership. And a lot of the younger people would go, what? You want us to do that? And we got this. So there's the paradox of you need to be honest, but there's a point at which you've also got to display confidence, even if that confidence is slightly self-generated.
And so, we see this in the corporate world all the time, where it reminds me in the early days of Afghanistan. Remember the Afghanistan communications minister? And there's at least for us civilians, here's shock and awe going off, bombs in Baghdad, and he's holding press conferences saying, there are no infidels in Baghdad. And so, clearly completely delusional. And so with that as an extreme example, how do you think we can walk that line as leaders between, on one hand, not BSing anybody, because people know you can put whipped cream on dog shit, but they know it's dog shit, right? So how do you be candid and direct and transparent, but at the same time, I mean, you have an incredible track record of being an inspirational leader that keeps people focused on the mission at hand. How do we walk that line?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I do is what you just said a few years ago, I would have said, absolutely, you're right. But the reality is now I go back to the Joseph Goebbels experience. If you say the same thing and you just keep saying it, there is a percentage of people who will believe it. I've seen that around the world, and you can make people doubt the truth in many cases or believe something that's absolutely false if you say it with enough repetition, with enough confidence. And social media, of course, allows it to come from multiple directions, even though it may have a single source. So I'm worried that what you said is still the reality. I want to believe that. And I think leaders have got to approach it with being as honest as you can all the time. Because if you are as honest and transparent as possible, when you have to deliver bad news or you get the opportunity to deliver good news, then suddenly it has a credibility that it just won't have if you've been spinning all the time. You look at the American people's view of politicians or business leaders or others, we're starting to discount them because we just assume that things are spun. And that actually makes it much harder to lead because it's sort of like Chicken Little. They hear one thing so much, we immediately say, well, of course, that's what they're going to say. And so it weakens the message. And I think organizations and leaders have got to really think that through. If you could protect your reputation as an organization, an individual for candor, I think it's the gold standard.
And isn't it, you called it a paradox, it's an irony that on one hand, as leaders, we feel like if we massage the truth a little and try to make people feel better about things, that we're doing a good job. But that as leaders is actually the thing that can end up undermining us, because if we're not being candid, we either look out of touch or we look like we're full of crap.
That's exactly right. Or when you need to get people motivated around something because things are not very good and you say, okay, things are great, people aren't going to rush to the ramparts because you didn't tell them you needed to do that. And so I think that you're right. Leaders put themselves in a bad position.
And so if I think about your books for a second, Stan, Walter Isaacson famously said of your book, Team of Teams, quote, in addition to being a fascinating and colorful read, this book is an indispensable guide to organizational change. And so as you think about this leadership question, and particularly this dimension of it, which is how do we be transparent, truthful, and clear and direct, but at the same time, keep people focused on the mission and inspire them forward. Can you unpack a little bit about that in Team of Teams?
Sure. The genesis of Team of Teams came from my observation that I had started my life in an industrial age world. The U.S. Army was sort of a classic bureaucracy. It was a good bureaucracy, a lot of good things about it, worked well. But it was a classic organization really created about the beginning of the 19th century. And it had developed this focus on being efficient. And all you have to do is be a little more efficient than your similarly organized competitor. And that worked pretty well for corporations, for governments, for education institutions and whatnot. Then with the growth of the information age, what happened is everything changed. Not the basic tenets of leadership, of honesty and whatnot. What happened was everything sped up because information could go so much faster. Also, we created so many more inputs or variables that suddenly our ability to manage something that was predictable or manage something to predictableness evaporated. And I ran into this in Iraq against Al-Qaeda in Iraq when they were an information technology organized entity, and they were completely different from their predecessors in Al-Qaeda, the original Al-Qaeda. And so when you were against this networked, constantly changing competitor, you either change or you got big problems. And what we found now is in businesses and governments and everything, they're in this swirling maelstrom, and how they operated before, decision-making processes, information sharing, just don't work like they used to. And yet people double down on them because that's what they were taught. That's what their parents did, their grandparents did. So it's natural. And they just keep getting further behind. So the motivation for Team of Teams was to first make the case for everybody. You're not stupider than your predecessors. You're in a different game. It changed fundamentally. And so here are the new rules, and here are the behaviors, and they're pretty significantly different than what you did before. And if you spend a lifetime trying to get up to the top of an organization as CEO or president or whatever, and you want to operate in that mechanical but well-organized system that you grew up in, you're going to fail because the organization will be too slow and too ponderous, too ineffective down at the point of action to do that. And so you got to lead in a different way.
And so do you think that's the primary difference, the generational difference, is the use of information technology in warfare?
It changed everything. Now, physical things sped up, airplanes fly faster, and all those other things helped that. But the most fundamental change is more people have more information faster. They change it, and that allows more people to be variables very, very rapidly, more organizations to leverage technology to have outsized influence. Think of a small terrorist group or whatever. They can do things that equivalent of a nation state would have been required even 20 years ago. So suddenly you have a different landscape there, which requires a much more adaptable ability to respond to that.
So if we were to fast forward, General, maybe 25 years, what percentage of our fighting forces are going to be behind a keyboard as opposed to, behind a machine gun or a tank?
Yeah, I think a very significant percentage, and they're not going to look like traditional, because behind a keyboard, they could be anywhere. They could be in their boxer shorts and, be older than you and I will be at that point.
I hate to cut you off, General, but we have a rule, Colin and I, when we talk to each other, that we both have to be wearing pants.
That's a fair rule. But it's going to change it dramatically because you're going to be able to leverage robotics, information technology, now artificial intelligence and those kinds of things, which are going to allow you to do so much. I still think that we're going to have a critical requirement for people with EQ, the ability to get up close and influence people. That's going to be very important, but we're going to have to figure out how to get those people with those skills to where they're needed. They might be behind keyboards as well. I mean, they might be reaching out to communities of interest digitally, but we still got the human factor that's going to have to be motivated, have to be led, have to be guided in different directions. So, but it's not going to be in the traditional everybody standing shoulder to shoulder.
The other question in this regard that's on my mind is, does information technology drive, to the discussion we were having earlier on sort of transparency, does it drive more transparency in a world where if people see, if you think about the concept of a whistleblower in the old world, it was very challenging, and not to say it isn't challenging today, but today, of course, we all have a way to raise our hand when we see something wrong in the world and say, hey, to quote the Big Lebowski, this aggression will not stand, man, and post something online, whether it's, being treated poorly at Walmart or something ill toward happening in some part of the world. And so does the sort of social media and technology and ability to share information like that also change the level of transparency?
I think fundamentally, and for the most part, that is really good, because you're not going to have dark corners where people do evil things that people don't know about. They're just the proliferation of cameras and whatnot is so great now. On the other side of the information technology is the ability for people to propagate very negative things or untrue things. And it's hard to discern between what's real and not. And it'll get harder in the future. Eventually, you'll be able to ferret it out. But for periods, you'll be able to be pretty influential with false information.
It certainly is interesting to see companies like Facebook and how they have, the term we use today, which is a bit of a BS term to me, evolved on their position vis-a-vis fake news. Because, of course, in the beginning, they said, hey, we're a platform. You can put whatever you want on the platform. And as the public outcry got louder, they said, okay, wait a minute, we need to put some things to allow, in the tech world, of course, we call it the wisdom of the crowds to take over, to weed out the garbage from what's real and what's not. Is that sort of evolution? Do you see that sort of evolution making a difference in our military?
I think it has to. The military relies on sort of a wisdom of the crowd. You get a massive amount of information now, and by cross-checking it, those things which are not correct should be identified. But I will tell you, my view has been affected by, I don't think that wisdom of the crowd is working like I thought it was going to. I thought the Wikipedia effect would bring what's real out much better than it has. I mean, look at our political environment in the world. I think what we found is we've been able to give a megaphone to people who propagate things that are just not true, and it gets a lot more staying power than it ought to. I hope that continues to move in a direction where that won't, as you say, won't stand. But I don't see it yet. And it concerns me because the more people get good at using media, even to propagate something that's incorrect for a limited period of time, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, and of course, when they connect it with images, as you well know, General, we're at a state where, if you sort of think about Photoshop in the early days, where you could do that with video and you can make it look like any of the three of us were anywhere and did anything, and it's impossible to really tell whether that was a real image that got captured or whether that was, fake news. The thing I hope for is that wisdom of the crowds does win out in the end, right? At the goodness of people, that people who care about the truth, people who care about our country and our world, the people in it, stand up and say, well, no, wait a minute, this is what I saw happen, or I have this video of this, or whatever the case may be, that ultimately that nefarious gets wiped out. We see it locally. Are you on Nextdoor by any chance?
No.
So have you seen it? So it's just interesting to see a small, your local social network take off, and the things that people coalesce around, right, and support each other around. And it can be very heartening to take place. And so, we just had a situation where I live where everybody coalesced around a local, the owner of a local market who was kind of getting a rough ride from the county, and it all kind of got cleaned up. And it's a small example, but, you see people coming together using this technology to do good things. And so, maybe I'm a little Pollyanna-ish. Certainly there are nefarious bastards out there, but my hope is that over time, enough of us stand out and say, hey, this is not right.
Oh, I think you're right. And think about, the most important thing sometimes is getting up close to a person or people and seeing things through their eyes. I think YouTube's very good for this, and there's some very good documentaries put out. You have this opinion about, let's say, auto workers, and you say auto workers were overpaid and and lazy, and therefore, when plants started closing, they got what they deserved. And then you watch a really well done documentary on people at an auto plant that's closing. You hear them. You're not talking to them yourself. You hear their perspective, how proud they were, how hard they worked. Suddenly you walk into it and say, wait a minute, I had a pretty skewed view. And that's true of so many things. And our ability to use technology to get there and create understanding. I'm not going to use the word empathy here, but understanding suddenly can lift the veil a little bit. Who do we hate around the world? We tend to hate those people we really don't know.
It's so funny. You're so right. In my personal experience as a civilian, I used to travel 300,000 to 400,000 miles a year, General, as an executive. And so I've been a lot of places and done business around the world. And Colin and I are surfers. We love to go on surf trips, and that takes you to wonderful different parts of the world. And you can be in the middle of the Mentawai Islands in Asia, very far away from anything you and I would call civilization, with people who grew up on those islands. And you would say, well, there's nobody in the world that I would have less in common with than those people. And yet it takes minutes to fall in love and to get fascinated with their culture and their customs and their food and want to play with them and do stuff and go surfing with them and et cetera, et cetera. And those perceived barriers of, these people who live on these islands in the middle of nowhere might as well be Martians, that goes away in seconds often when we meet these foreigners, whatever that means.
If you think about it, people who travel a lot tend not to be as prejudiced. Now, that's a bold statement I've made. I can't prove with data, but my experience is the more places you've been, the more things you see, you suddenly realize that there are a lot of different ways of living life, and we don't necessarily have them all right in the way we live our lives.
Yeah, I can remember as a little boy, Stan, growing up, I never thought I'd go anywhere or do anything. We grew up very modestly and so forth. And so to think that I've been able to travel the way that I have, but, I saw these parts of the world, whether it was the Middle East or India or, you pick a spot. And as a boy, that might as well have been Mars. And so as I continued to grow up and didn't have an experience of being in these parts of the world, sort of some of that lingers, and a tragedy happens somewhere in the Middle East or in India or in Dubai or whatever it is. And you don't really feel that much. I mean, as human beings, you feel, oh, that's bad news, but we don't feel it. I don't know if it's just because I'm getting older or because of my experience, but when I turn on the news and there's a tragedy in Paris or there's an earthquake in Bali or whatever it is, I mean, I'm man enough to admit I will sit there and tear up, because these people in these places are not a theoretical experience to me anymore. Can you sort of light up for us a little bit, your version of that, given your incredible experience?
Yeah, very similar, particularly, and I will highlight most in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. You go to an area and you're very frustrated because the area is operating under the enemy's control or whatnot. And you get up close to the people, and what you find is they are doing the best they can, and they are trying to triangulate or balance between the competing pushes here. And so we come in to solve the problem, and we're a temporary force. We're not going to stay there. And so they're trying to figure out, okay, wait a minute, how do I react to this temporary force who are not bad? They don't think of us as bad, but they don't think of us as enduring. So they're trying to respond to the fact that after the police leave us, the gang is still going to be in the neighborhood. So how do they deal with that? And you can see them trying to do the right thing. You try to deal with them. I went in to meet with some elders late at night before we went to recapture this province district called Marshall in early 2011 in Afghanistan. And it had been under Taliban control for several years, under tight Taliban control, and retaking it was going to be a significant fight. But we brought some of the elders out so I could meet with them late at night before we went in. And I asked them, do you want us to come in? Do you want us to do this? And they said, they looked at me, and big bearded guys, Pashtuns with turbans on and whatnot. We're sitting on the floor of this little hut, and they said, we do, but here's the deal. We only want you to come if you're going to stay. We only want you to come if you're going to not bring back in a guy named SMA, we called him. He had been the district chief before. He was very, very corrupt and autocratic. And then they say, we don't want you to recapture the district in a way where we get killed in the process. That would not be helpful. And it was pretty reasonable stuff, but they look at you and they go, this is our lives. It's a fight for you. It's our lives forever. And suddenly you look at him and you go, wow, this is different from a military objective.
Fascinating. So maybe shift the conversation a little bit, if we could, Stan. Colin and I believe that there's a connection between entrepreneurship and our military, law enforcement, and fire service, in that you folks protect our country, and entrepreneurs in many ways build our country. And to me, while there are other things that are, of course, incredibly important and certainly equally important, but it's hard to think of things that are more important than building and protecting our country and our world. And so in that context, we'd love to ask you about, you have this 30-year military career plus. You become one of the most storied leaders in modern American history, and you serve our country so well. And now you're an entrepreneur. So can you share with us a little bit about, at this stage of your life, having protected our country, why you want to build your business and ultimately our country through your new business?
Yeah, exactly. First, I absolutely agree. I think entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial businesses are the secret of America's future. They are the energy. They will shape it. They will do all the things that we want to do to make America go forward. Because, to be honest, many of the industries and things we had in the past are not sustainable in a modern global economy. So we are going to have to move forward. And so the energy and the adeptness that we show on that, to me, is critical. It's a national imperative. And so we ought to do everything we can to push in that direction. But it's not just entrepreneurship and software. It's in all kinds of things. I got very interested in the idea that one of the things that challenges entrepreneurship is basic leadership. It's how organizations work. The ones that are successful are not necessarily the organization with the best product or the best single idea or the person who can code the best or build whatever. It's the people that can get together, they can create a shared sense of purpose, they can run an organization tolerably well so that they're efficient enough to make money and move forward, and they're effective enough to do it. But they're also flexible enough to go down one path, change, and keep adapting, the Darwinistic process at hyper speed to do that. We find that on the battlefield. And the reason it's so comfortable to me is the military traditionally prepares for a war for years and years and years. And they do that based upon what the last war was like. And then they try to extrapolate predict the next war. And we always got it wrong. And so we went to the next war and we found out we had to change. Nowadays, that has compressed so much that when we went to Iraq and Afghanistan, the wars were completely different from what we expected. And each year they were incredibly different from the year prior. So it was this iterative change. That process in our economy is what fascinates me. Building leaders who are prepared to do that, building organizations who are good at that, and then building an infrastructure around it, government laws and all that kind of thing that enables that is what I'm fascinated about.
And is that why you say today it's important to, I want to get the quote right, bring lessons from the battlefield to the boardroom?
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think that the big lesson is that we figured it out on the battlefield and we got to bring it to civilians who didn't figure it out. What I try to tell people is they are so remarkably similar. An entrepreneurial business in a competitive environment is so much like war that we could take people like you and many others, put uniforms on you, and in about 2 weeks, you'd feel at home on the battlefield. It's a similar vibe and feeling. And so the same people and ideas prevail.
Interesting. And tell us a little bit about, the work you do at the McChrystal Group.
Yeah, what we do is we go into organizations and we call ourselves a leadership advisory firm. What we really do is we help an organization adjust how they operate so that from leader behaviors at the top to some of the processes internally of how they share information, how they create what we call shared consciousness, and how the organization aligns on a strategy. So we're not a traditional consulting firm. We don't come in and analyze something and leave a bunch of slides and say, here, fix this. What we do is we come in and we assume that the organization is competent in what they do. We assume that they've got reasonably effective people. And so we come in and we look and say, how do we make this team more effective and capable of constantly adapting? And we run a gamut of clients from consumer products to in a big hospital to Wall Street banks. And all of those have this similar, it's all unique problems, but similar challenges that we see just tremendous transformation.
And, we've witnessed something, in my opinion, over the last few years where I'll say the polite version of it, the softening of the American corporation from a culture perspective. There's a little bit of this everybody gets a cookie, participation award kind of BS starting to filter into our work world. This is where I do my grumpy old man routine here, Stanley. And so it is part, and we recently had on this gal named Amy Morin, who's sort of very famous for helping people develop mental toughness. So she's also been on my mind. And so what are the mental toughness sort of learnings from the military that you think are appropriate to the corporate world?
Yeah, I used to say something to our organization, my command in Iraq and Afghanistan. I said, this is a war. There is going to be a winner and a loser. And we could lose just as much as win. And not everybody's going to get a trophy and not everybody's going to go home alive. So you start with that big wake-up call and you go to corporations. The great thing about capitalism is there's a score sheet. There is, you either are successful and you can make money, or you're not. And
you're either a legend or a loser.
That's exactly right.
Sorry, I had to interrupt.
No, I love that because it's a discipline. And when you don't have a discipline in a system and there's not a way to fail, then it's hard for anybody to truly succeed.
Wow.
That's unbelievable. And General, we have to ask, you must be out doing some speeches, yes?
I am. Yeah, having a great time doing that.
Yeah, I got to believe you're an awesome keynote speaker. Colin and I watch some of your videos online, your TED Talk and things of that like. It must be extraordinary to be live in a room when you do one of your talks. And do you enjoy doing that?
Well, it's funny. I didn't think I would, but I do. And the reason I do is not because I find myself entertaining, but I talk to this range of organizations, and how people respond and the questions asked is fascinating to me. And so I learn more than they ever learned from me, for sure.
And so if I'm not mistaken, you're at Yale right now, are you not?
I am. I'm finishing up my 7th year. This semester, I'm finishing up my 7th year. I teach one course a semester. And I work with the football team as well on their leadership program.
And could you give us the thumbnail version of your course if we want the General's course in
Sure.
3 minutes?
It's a seminar with 13 two-hour sessions. And it's 20 students, and we have about 200 people apply each semester, and we select 20. And it's 14 graduate students and 6 undergrads. And we look at leadership, not from a military standpoint, but we look at it. We start with sort of what is a leader, and we start with values and the basics. But then we go through a number of things like dealing with failure, crisis decision-making. Tonight in our class, we'll talk about the military and the media, and I will talk about the Rolling Stone article that had such an effect on me. And I'll talk with the class about the media environment is a reality. It's not something they choose when they're in a leadership position to ignore or engage with. It's just there. And so how do you think about it? And so we take these young people along this semester-long journey, and we build a team out of them. Tomorrow, after class, we head to Gettysburg, and we'll spend 2 days at Gettysburg studying leadership with a group, not the tactics so much, but leadership. And that'll finish the semester, and they will remain connected as a group, for years in the future. That's what's been our experience in the past.
Wow. And if you could, maybe a little bit on what you do with, you said the football team?
Yeah. About 5 years ago, the coach contacted me right as he was taking over. They had some turnover. And he said that I want to make Yale's football program be a great football team. But one of the central ideas is, because you can't give in the Ivy Leagues, you can't give scholarships or anything. I want to make the leadership experience be the differentiator. I want to make our team have this leadership ethos. And it starts freshman year. And they have this program that goes through the 4 years. And as they're rising seniors, 2 weeks ago, I took the rising seniors, about 30 of them, took them to Gettysburg, and we spent 2 days, and we had this dinner, and they stayed there till 2:30 in the morning talking to each other. And it's an ability for them to make the football experience really a vehicle for the rest of their lives. And it's been pretty impressive. And I think I've now hired 4 of the football players into my company, and they're doing great.
That says a lot.
Is this all a scam, General, to just get the best graduates from Yale to come work for McChrystal Group? Is that what's going on?
Well, scam's a powerful word, but we'll say strategy.
Actually, the term we heard our friend Amy use that I like was she called it her hustle. So maybe this is your hustle to get some of the best students from Yale to come and work with you.
And it's worked beautifully.
And we also have to ask you about the future, both yours personally and professionally, and then we can get to America's in a second. But as you think about this chapter of your life, being a granddad, being an entrepreneur, working with business leaders, tell us about sort of the next 20 years of your life as you see it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can look 20. I just wrote a letter to my class. I had an assignment for everyone in the class to write a letter to themselves 5 years in the future. And the idea is they'll look at this letter 5 years from now and they'll say, am I what I said 5 years ago I wanted to be? So I wrote my own version. And in 5 years, I'll be 67 years old. And I described, I still want to be involved with my company, McChrystal Group, but I don't want to be day to day as central as I might be. I want to be enabling for the people running it. I want to still be teaching at Yale and affecting young people. I'd like to be part of the national conversation, but I don't want to be a political figure. I want to be able to contribute to thought and ideas, and I want the ideas on leadership. I just concluded a contract to write another book on leaders, and it's the most ambitious book yet. We're going to take the model of Plutarch's Lives, and we're going to compare pairs of leaders through history to create, to address a hypothesis that we have. But I want to be involved in that conversation, and I want to be really, come back to sort of where we started. I want to be a better husband. I want to be a better father than I was, and I want to be a great grandfather.
That's unbelievable. Anything else you'd like to share with us, General?
No, Chris, it's been an honor. I love what you're doing. The direction on this and just focusing on how people think and sharing it with other people, I think is really of great value.
Well, thank you. And as you were talking about the things you were doing, I couldn't help but thinking, I don't know if you were thinking this, Colin, that Stan should start a podcast.
I think that's a great idea.
But I think it'd be fun.
You'd be great at it, and the lessons that you bring and the lessons you're now developing as you work with clients and so forth, you're a natural. So you'd be a great podcaster. So we'd encourage you to do that. We'd share with you anything about our journey on that. And if you decide not to be, for some reason, a podcaster, in addition to a best-selling author, an entrepreneur, and of course, an incredible member of our military. But if you decide not to do the podcasting thing, then just assume Legends and Losers is your podcast, and you can do anything you want with it anytime you want.
Well, you're too kind. And I may take you up on advice that the podcast thing, I think these are so powerful. They're extended form journalism in a new format.
Well, and we talked a little bit about the technology earlier and how it's changing things on a social level. The amazing thing to us about podcasting is, two guys can start a cable channel for almost no money.
Right.
And so, you look at it today, and you talked about Yale, of course, and many of the top universities in the world are putting either all of or huge components of their curriculum online. So if you want the education without the piece of paper, you can absolutely get it. And if you think about podcasting, there are experts in fields from boat building to category design and everything in between who share their knowledge freely. And then, of course, there are books that are now available for download on Audible and other sources. And so I just look at all of that, Stan, and I think there's no excuse for being stupid today.
That is true.
And I know the world really appreciates your service and your knowledge and your incredible generosity in wanting to share that, whether it's in your books or in your teaching or through your consulting group or through coming on Legends and Losers. And I think, the technology now affords a platform for some of the greatest leaders of our time like you to share their knowledge and wisdom in a way that, if you think about it, you tell me 20 years ago, this wasn't happening.
Right.
A bunch of derelicts like us were not talking to a storied military leader like you.
No, I think the opportunity to have this kind of conversation was so limited. And so I thank you for giving me the chance to be a small part of it.
Well, you're a big part of it. And of course, we have to and deeply want to thank you for your legendary service to our country and the world. You're a warrior and a peacemaker.
Well, you're kind.
And we love you for it.
You're kind, and thank you very much.
Thank you, General.
Take care.
Be legendary. Wow. Well, there you have it. Our dialogue with the General. And if you're at all a regular listener to Legends and Losers, you know that myself and Colin are incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to have the dialogues that we have with the people that we have them with. And that was never more true than it was the day we had the privilege of having a conversation with our new buddy Stan. All right, we would like to shout out to Bob O'Brien, who is the Analyst Relations Manager at Akamai Technologies, for his fantastic share of the Amy Marin episode of Legends and Losers on LinkedIn. Thanks, Bob. We really appreciate your support. We'd also like to thank Lee Duke for his LinkedIn shout out. A huge thank you to the marketing team at NetSuite and 800 CEO Reed. We'll tell you the story on a different day, but suffice it to say, the NetSuite marketing team and the legendary people at 800 CEO Reed came together, and in about 24 hours were able to put together a big order of Play Bigger and have them there in time for my speech and therefore book signing at Sweet World, which was sweet unto itself. Also like to thank someone who calls themselves Bree GF for their iTunes review, and our dear friend, the legendary Scott Lowry, CEO of Fathom, a extraordinary digital marketing firm who helps accelerate revenue, for a legendary iTunes review. Please subscribe on iTunes. We're also on Stitcher, YouTube, and check us out there. You might get a kick out of the YouTube shows. Remember, this podcast is not free. It costs 2 minutes to give us a legendary review. You can find us on Facebook.com/groups/legends and losers, on the Twitter machine @legendslosers. And you can always email us, blackhole@legendsandlosers.com. We love hearing from you. With that, we would like to thank HarperCollins, the bestseller Play Bigger, How Pirates, Dreamers, and Innovators Create and Dominate Markets. Equity Directory, connecting startups to the talent and the resources they need to build a legendary business. One Life Fully Lived, the nonprofit helping you dream, plan, and live your best life. The Horn Group, legendary PR in Silicon Valley, New York, and beyond. The McChrystal Group, legends from the battlefield to the boardroom. 800 CEO Reed, put a legendary book in your brain. The World Wildlife Fund, don't forget, animals are people too. Mike Block, realtor in Santa Cruz, California. Make your Santa Cruz dream happen with Mike Block. Our dear friend Jamie Masters, who is the host of the top-rated podcast Eventual Millionaire, was stoked to be a guest on her show. And our dear friend David Osborne's new book, Wealth Can't Wait. We'd like to remind you that today's information is provided to you solely for informational purposes. This oddcast is the sole property of the Legends and Losers Oddcast Network. Please feel free to share the shit out of it. We'd also like to warn you that this oddcast was produced in a studio that does contain nuts. Teach entrepreneurship. Remember, you can't be a legend without being a loser. Don't be lame. Get out of the passing lane. Go ahead. Eat some cake. Reaccommodate your own alternate facts. Introduce 2 people you love to 2 podcasts you love. Don't forget, Legends and Losers is also on YouTube. And that was more of an hour. That was more than an hour of your life you'll never get back. Hey, man, this podcast really ties the room together. And we need to apologize to United CEO Oscar Munoz. Sorry, Oscar. We just ran out of time for you. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate you tuning in, and be legendary.